She was about to be sold, not for work, but for survival. And he was a man haunted by a past he couldn't change, until the moment he chose to save her. But can two broken souls build something stronger than fear? The lesson here: love can be born in the darkest moments, and still change everything. This channel tells heartfelt stories of the Wild West, where love, sacrifice, family bonds, and human kindness shine through hardship. If this story moves you, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The clink of silver coins hitting scarred pine sounded exactly like nails being driven into a coffin. Clara Vance stood in the center of the windowless back room of the Golden Rose Saloon, her lungs burning with the stench of stale whiskey, cheap cigars, and unwashed bodies. She kept her chin tipped upward, her spine rigid despite the violent trembling in her knees. Her emerald silk dress, a remnant of a refined Boston life that felt like a century ago, was torn at the hem and stained with the Wyoming dust. She would not cry. She would not give the circle of leering men the satisfaction of her tears. $300, Sheriff Cobb drawled, leaning back in his chair. He tapped a rolled piece of parchment against the tin star pinned to his greasy vest. That's what the late Arthur Vance owed Mr. Gentry at the faro tables. Since Arthur had a sudden, unfortunate accident, his debts passed to his only living blood. This here is a 10-year indentured labor contract, fully legal. Who's starting the bidding? It wasn't a labor contract. Everyone in the stifling room knew it. It was a bill of sale for a human being. $350, grunted a heavily bearded miner, his eyes trailing over Clara like she was a prime cut of beef. Clara dug her fingernails into her palms until the skin broke. Just 3 days ago, her uncle had promised her a new beginning out west. Now he was dead in a ditch, and she was being liquidated to cover his gambling debts to Elias Gentry, the territory's most ruthless land baron. $400, slurred a ranch hand from the corner, stepping closer. He reached out to finger the torn silk of her sleeve. Clara flinched, jerking her arm back. "Don't touch me." The room erupted in coarse laughter. Cobb smirked. "Got some fire in her. 400 going once." In the darkest corner of the room, leaning against the damp wall, Silas Thorne felt a suffocating tightness close around his throat. The roaring in his ears wasn't from the saloon out front. It was the phantom echo of a memory he had spent 5 years trying to drown in cheap whiskey and backbreaking labor. He closed his eyes, but all he saw was his younger sister cornered and crying, while he had been too late, too weak, and too poor to stop the monster who broke her. Silas opened his eyes. They locked onto Clara. She was terrified, completely alone, yet standing with a fierce, brittle defiance that struck him right in the chest. $450, another man shouted. Cobb raised his hand, ready to strike the gavel. $450 going twice. The heavy, rhythmic jingle of silver spurs cut through the noise. The men parted instinctively as Silas stepped into the flickering lantern light. He was a towering, broad-shouldered silhouette in a dust-caked duster, his weathered face shadowed by the low brim of his Stetson. His eyes were the color of a winter storm, cold and entirely uncompromising. Silas didn't say a word. He walked straight to the table, reached inside his heavy canvas coat, and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He slammed it down onto the pine with enough force to rattle the empty whiskey glasses. $500, Silas said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. Silence fell over the crowd. Cobb blinked, his greedy eyes darting from the heavy pouch to Silas's stony expression. "Well now, Thorne," Cobb sneered, though he made no move to push the money back. "Didn't take you for a man who had coin to spare on a woman. 500, going once, twice, sold." Cobb tossed the rolled parchment onto the table. Silas ignored the sheriff. He picked up the contract, folding it once, twice, and shoving it into his pocket. Then he turned to Clara. She braced herself, staring up at the towering cowboy, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She expected a rough hand, a possessive grip, a cruel command. Instead, Silas stepped between her and the crowd, turning his broad back to the men, effectively shielding her from their predatory stares. He didn't grab her wrists. He simply raised one calloused, leather-gloved hand and gently touched her elbow to guide her toward the door. He leaned down, the faint scent of leather, pine, and rain washing over her. "You're safe now," he whispered. The words hit Clara with the force of a physical blow. The absolute certainty in his rough voice broke the dam she had been holding back. A single tear slipped down her cheek, but she nodded, letting him guide her out of the suffocating back room and into the freezing, biting wind of the Wyoming night. The cold air shocked her lungs back to life. Silas dropped his hand from her elbow the moment they were outside, giving her space as he walked over to untie a massive roan gelding from the hitching post. Clara wrapped her arms around her shivering shoulders. I don't know how to repay you, Mr. Thorne. I have nothing." Silas didn't look at her as he checked the saddle cinch. "Didn't ask for repayment. You can take the morning stagecoach east. The debt's gone." Before Clara could process the magnitude of what he was saying, the swinging doors of the Golden Rose Saloon burst open, letting out a cacophony of piano music and drunken laughter. Sheriff Cobb stood on the boardwalk, lighting a cigar, flanked by two of Gentry's men. "I'll be damned," Cobb chuckled, the sound carrying easily on the crisp wind. "Thorne's a bigger fool than his old man. He just handed over the exact sum he owed the bank." The man next to Cobb spat into the dirt. "Gentry bought that mortgage last week. Since Thorne just blew his last dime on a stray girl, Gentry's going to take the Broken Spur Ranch by the end of the month anyway." Clara froze. The blood drained from her face. She turned her head slowly, looking at the quiet, hardened cowboy standing beside his horse. He hadn't just bought her freedom with spare coin. He had just handed over his land, his livelihood, and his entire future. Silas finally met her gaze over the saddle. His jaw flexed, but his storm-gray eyes gave absolutely nothing away. He had saved her life, but the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. And now, he was trapped in it with her. The ride to the Broken Spur Ranch was a brutal education in the Wyoming cold. Clara clung to the back of Silas Thorne's saddle. Her frozen fingers gripped tightly into the heavy canvas of his duster. The wind howled across the open plains, carrying the sharp bite of impending frost. But the man sitting in front of her was a wall of solid, unyielding heat. He rode with a fluid grace, seemingly immune to the freezing temperatures. His gaze fixed on the endless sea of black sagebrush. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, weighted with the horrific reality of what had just transpired in the Golden Rose Saloon, and the crushing revelation Clara had overheard on the boardwalk. "He gave up his land for me." Silas's mind was a turbulent storm, though his face remained carved from granite. Every rhythmic thud of the roan's hooves against the hardened earth echoed the drumming in his chest. $500. It was the last of the blood money he had scraped together, dollar by painful dollar, to keep Elias Gentry's greedy hands off his family's land. And he had just thrown it onto a whiskey-soaked table for a woman he didn't know. He told himself it wasn't about her. It was about the ghost that haunted the corners of his vision. When he had looked at Clara, cornered, terrified, but refusing to bow her head, he hadn't seen a stranger from Boston. He had seen his younger sister, Nora. He had seen the same desperate defiance right before the world had broken her. He had been too late for Nora. He couldn't be too late again. An hour later, the silhouette of a dilapidated cabin rose against the starry sky. It was a rugged, austere structure of weathered pine, leaning slightly against the relentless westerly winds. A sagging barn stood a few dozen yards away, alongside a fractured corral. Silas pulled the roan to a halt and dismounted. He reached up, grasping Clara by the waist. His hands were massive, calloused, and surprisingly gentle as he lifted her down. Her legs gave way the moment her boots hit the frozen dirt, completely numb from the ride, but Silas caught her elbow, steadying her effortlessly. "It ain't the Palmer house," he murmured, his voice a low rasp in the dark. "But the roof holds mostly." He led her inside and struck a match. The flare of yellow light revealed a single-room cabin that was painfully bare. A cast-iron stove sat in the center, flanked by a crude wooden table, two mismatched chairs, and a narrow cot tucked into the far corner. The floorboards were uneven and coated in a fine layer of prairie dust. Silas moved to the hearth, tossing in some kindling and lighting a fire. The flames quickly caught, casting dancing shadows against the bare logs. He stood up, reached into the deep pocket of his coat, and pulled out the rolled parchment. The indentured labor contract. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Without a word, Silas tossed the parchment directly into the center of the flames. Clara stepped forward, her eyes wide as she watched the edges of the paper curl, turn black, and dissolve into glowing orange ash. The legal document that had bound her to a monster was gone in seconds. "The eastbound stagecoach comes through Silver Creek tomorrow at noon," Silas said, not looking at her. He unbuckled his gun belt and draped it over the back of a chair. "I'll ride you into town at dawn. I've got enough coin left to buy you a ticket as far as Omaha. From there you can wire whatever family you've got left in the East." Clara stared at the ashes. I don't have any family left. My uncle was the last." She slowly turned to face him. "And I'm not getting on that stagecoach." Silas frowned, the lines around his eyes deepening. "This ain't a place for a city woman, Miss Vance. There's nothing out here but dirt, drought, and men who'd rather shoot you than look at you. You go east. You start over." "Start over with what?" Clara's voice shook, but she forced her chin up. "I have no money, no home, and no reputation. And what about you? I heard what the sheriff said. You used your mortgage money to buy that contract. Gentry is going to take this farm because of me." "That's my burden," Silas said flatly, "not yours. It became my burden the moment you bought my life, Mr. Thorne." Clara took a step closer. The heat of the fire warmed her back, but it was the fierce intensity in her emerald eyes that seemed to raise the temperature in the room. "I am not a charity case. I refuse to be the reason a good man loses his home. I am staying. I will work. I will help you find a way to pay that debt." Silas let out a harsh, humorless breath. He looked at her ruined silk dress, her delicate, unblemished hands, and the pale perfection of her face. "You don't know the first thing about surviving out here." "Then you will teach me," she challenged, refusing to back down. Silas stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He saw the iron will beneath the fragile exterior. Finally, he gave a slow shake of his head. "Take the bed. Try to get some sleep. We'll argue about this when the sun comes up." Clara was too exhausted to fight him further. She lay down on the narrow cot, pulling the scratchy wool blanket up to her chin. She expected Silas to make a pallet on the floor. Instead, he pulled a wooden chair directly in front of the cabin's heavy oak door. He sat down, propped his boots on a wooden crate, and laid his Winchester rifle horizontally across his thighs. Clara watched him through half-closed eyes. As the hours crept by, Silas never moved. He didn't close his eyes. He just sat there, a silent, brooding sentinel, staring into the shadows. It was in the dead of the night that Clara truly understood. He wasn't a fairy tale knight. He was a deeply damaged man, haunted by demons he couldn't outrun, standing guard against a world he expected to betray him at any moment. When the first gray light of dawn crept through the cracked window, Silas was gone, already out tending to his meager herd. Clara sat up. Her muscles screamed in protest, aching from the journey and the terror of the previous day. She looked down at the emerald silk dress she wore. It was a symbol of Boston, a symbol of the helpless, refined girl who had been dragged to an auction block. With a sudden, violent motion, Clara grabbed the torn hem of the skirt and ripped it upward. The silk tore with a sharp, satisfying sound. She ripped it again, tearing away the heavy, restrictive layers until the dress was shortened to her calves, allowing her to move freely. She used the excess fabric to tie her loose dark hair back from her face and fashioned a crude apron around her waist. She found a wooden bucket, carried it to the hand pump outside, and filled it with freezing water. She found a bristle brush and a bar of lye soap. When Silas returned to the cabin 2 hours later, he stopped dead in the doorway. The floorboards were scrubbed clean. The faint scent of stale tobacco had been banished by the sharp smell of lye. Clara was on her hands and knees, her forearms covered in soapy water, scrubbing fiercely at a stain near the hearth. Her delicate hands were already red and raw. She paused, pushing a stray strand of hair out of her eyes with the back of her wrist, and looked up at him. "The coffee is on the stove, and I noticed the corral fence is loose. If you have a hammer, I can start fixing it after I finish the floors." Silas stared at her, taking in the shredded silk, the stubborn set of her jaw, and the undeniable fire in her eyes. He slowly removed his Stetson, running a hand through his dark, unruly hair. "You're a stubborn woman, Clara Vance." "I am," she agreed smoothly, picking up her brush. "You'll just have to get used to it." 4 days passed, and the reality of the Wyoming frontier stripped away whatever illusions Clara had left. Survival here was not a romantic endeavor. It was a grueling, bone-deep war of attrition. She worked until her body felt like it was made of lead. She learned to chop kindling, her hands quickly developing painful, bursting blisters that bled into the wooden handle of the axe. She learned to cook edible meals out of salted pork, hardtack, and meager rations of flour. She fought the relentless dust that blew through the cracks in the cabin walls. And through it all, she watched Silas. He worked with a punishing intensity, mending fences, breaking wild soil, and tending to the small, scrawny herd of cattle he had left. They spoke little. Their communication was a silent dance of shared chores and quiet observations. Yet despite the silence, the air between them was constantly thrumming with an unspoken electric tension. Clara found her eyes wandering to the broad expanse of his shoulders as he swung a sledgehammer, the play of muscles beneath his sweat-drenched shirt, the sharp, rugged line of his jaw. But admiration wasn't going to save them from Elias Gentry. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Clara marched out to the corral where Silas was brushing down the roan gelding. The wind whipped her dark hair around her face. "I need to learn how to shoot," she announced, her voice cutting through the whistling wind. "And I need to learn how to ride." Silas paused, resting his hand on the horse's flank. He turned his storm-gray eyes toward her. "You're doing fine with the cabin." "The cabin won't matter if Gentry's men come riding over that ridge," Clara retorted, closing the distance between them. "I was helpless in that saloon. I will never be helpless again. If we are going to fight for this land, I cannot be a liability, Silas. Teach me." Silas looked at the fierce determination burning in her eyes. He knew she was right. Gentry didn't play by the rules, and a woman out here who couldn't defend herself was a walking target. "All right," he said softly. "We start with the horse." He led out a smaller, speckled mare named Penny. She was gentle but stubborn. Silas showed Clara how to saddle the beast, how to check the cinch, and how to mount. When Clara struggled to pull herself up into the heavy western saddle, Silas stepped up behind her. "Put your weight in the stirrup," he instructed. His large hands gripped her waist, his thumbs pressing into the soft curve just above her hips. Clara's breath hitched. The sudden searing heat of his touch sent a shockwave straight up her spine. She could feel the hard, solid wall of his chest just inches from her back. She hoisted herself up, swinging her leg over, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm that had nothing to do with the horse. "Keep your heels down," Silas murmured, stepping back, though his gaze lingered on her a second longer than necessary. "Hold the reins loose. You try to choke her, she'll fight you. You guide her. Let her think it's her idea." For the next hour, Clara rode in circles around the corral. Her inner thighs burned, her back ached, but she refused to stop until Silas finally nodded in approval. "Get down," he commanded. "Now for the rifle." He walked over to the porch and retrieved his Winchester repeater. He carried it back to the corral, setting up 3 empty tin cans on the top rail of the fence about 30 yards away. He handed the rifle to Clara. It was shockingly heavy, cold iron and polished wood that smelled sharply of sulfur and gun oil. "Tuck the stock firm into the pocket of your shoulder," Silas instructed, stepping up beside her. "If you hold it loose, the kickback will break your collarbone." Clara brought the heavy rifle up, squinting down the barrel. Her arms trembled under the weight. "You're too tense," Silas said. Before she could adjust, he stepped directly behind her. His chest pressed lightly against her back. He reached around her, his thick arms bracketing hers. His left hand covered her left hand on the barrel, his long, calloused fingers wrapping over her knuckles to steady the weapon. His right hand hovered over hers near the trigger. The world seemed to shrink to the few inches of space between them. Clara's senses were overwhelmed. The smell of horses, sweat, and the masculine, woodsy scent of Silas enveloped her completely. She could feel the steady, rhythmic thud of his heart against her shoulder blade. "Breathe in," Silas whispered, his voice a low rumble right beside her ear. His breath ghosted across her neck, making her shiver. "Let half of it out. Hold it. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull. Squeeze." Clara tried to focus on the tin can, but her entire body was acutely, painfully aware of the man pressed against her. She held her breath and squeezed the trigger. Crack! The rifle roared, kicking back with a vicious force. Even with Silas bracing her, the recoil slammed the metal stock hard into her shoulder. Clara gasped, stumbling back a step, right into Silas's solid chest. He caught her instantly, his arms wrapping around her waist to keep her upright. "You missed," he noted, his voice slightly husky. "The gun kicked," Clara breathed, her heart racing as she lingered in his hold for a fraction of a second before stepping forward. She gritted her teeth, ignoring the throbbing pain blossoming in her shoulder. She racked the lever, chambering another round. Again! She fired 5 more times. By the last shot, one of the tin cans went flying into the dirt. Clara lowered the rifle, her chest heaving, a triumphant, brilliant smile breaking across her face. She turned to Silas, her eyes shining with adrenaline. "I hit it." Silas stared down at her. Her face was smudged with dirt. Her hair was falling out of its crude tie, and her hands were trembling. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The urge to reach out, to pull her against him and taste the wild triumph on her lips, was a sudden physical ache. He forced himself to take a step back, breaking the spell. "You hit it, but you're bleeding." Clara looked down. The friction of the reins and the heavy lever of the rifle had torn open the blisters on her palms. Blood was smeared across her skin. She hadn't even felt it. That evening, the cabin was quiet, lit only by the golden glow of the hearth. Clara sat at the table while Silas washed her hands in a basin of warm water. He moved with agonizing care, his rough fingers gentle as they cleaned the torn skin. He applied a foul-smelling herbal salve, then carefully wrapped her palms in clean, white bandages. Clara watched his face, studying the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the shadow of stubble on his jaw. "Why did you do it, Silas?" she asked softly, the silence of the cabin making her brave. "Why did you throw away your life savings for me?" Silas's hands went still. He kept his eyes focused on the bandage he was tying. "I told you, it was—" "Don't tell me it was just the right thing to do," Clara interrupted gently. "I see how you watch the door at night. I see the ghosts in your eyes. Who were you trying to save in that saloon?" Silas closed his eyes, a muscle feathering in his jaw. The silence stretched until Clara thought he wouldn't answer. "Her name was Nora," Silas finally rasped, the name sounding like broken glass in his throat. "My little sister. 5 years ago, a man came to town. Charming, rich. He promised her the world. I told her not to trust him, but I was out on the trail too much to stop it. He didn't marry her. He sold her debts to a brothel in Cheyenne to cover his own gambling losses. Clara gasped softly. Silas. I tracked them down, Silas continued, his grip tightening slightly on Clara's bandaged hand. Took me 3 weeks. By the time I found the place, she had taken her own life. Couldn't live with the shame. I was too late. I had the money in my pocket to buy her out, and I was too damn late. He finally looked up, his storm-gray eyes bright with unshed, agonizing grief. When I saw you standing there, surrounded by those animals, I couldn't be too late again. Clara's heart broke for the hardened cowboy. Without thinking, she reached out with her bandaged hands and cupped his rough, stubbled cheek. You weren't late, Silas. You saved me. Silas leaned into her touch, closing his eyes. For a singular, suspended moment, the ghosts retreated. The warmth of her hands chased away the Wyoming cold. The moment was shattered by the frantic, thundering sound of approaching hoofbeats. Silas's eyes snapped open. The vulnerability vanished, instantly replaced by lethal readiness. He grabbed his Winchester from the table and moved to the window, pulling back the edge of the burlap sack that served as a curtain. Clara stood up, her pulse spiking. Is it Gentry? Worse, Silas growled. It's his dog. Sheriff Cobb pulled his horse to a halt in the yard, kicking up a cloud of dust. He didn't dismount. He sat tall in the saddle, flanked by 2 armed deputies, a smug, oily smile plastered across his face. Silas opened the cabin door and stepped out onto the porch, his rifle hanging casually, yet dangerously at his side. Clara stepped out right behind him, refusing to hide. Beautiful evening, Thorne, Cobb called out, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Thought I'd save the post-rider a trip. Got some official legal correspondence for you. Cobb pulled a folded piece of heavy, stamped paper from his vest and tossed it into the dust at the base of the porch stairs. Mr. Gentry has officially assumed the deed of trust on the broken spur from the Territorial Bank, Cobb announced, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. You missed a payment 2 days ago. Gentry is calling the note due. You have exactly 3 months to produce $800 in cash. If you don't... Cobb's eyes slid past Silas, landing heavily on Clara. His smile turned predatory. Mr. Gentry will seize the property, the livestock, and any assets residing on the land, including the lovely Miss Vance, seeing as her original debt was never legally satisfied by a man who didn't actually own the money he paid with. Silas leveled the Winchester, pointing the barrel squarely at Cobb's chest. The metallic clack of the hammer being cocked echoed like a cannon shot in the quiet yard. Get off my land, Silas said, his voice a lethal, vibrating threat. Before I put a hole in that tin star. Cobb raised his hands in mock surrender, laughing as he pulled his horse around. 3 months, Thorne. $800. Start digging for gold, boy. The sheriff and his deputies rode off, their laughter trailing behind them like a foul odor. Silas lowered the rifle, his knuckles white. $800. It was an impossible sum. It might as well have been $1 million. Clara stepped up beside him. She looked at the dust settling in the yard, then at the man who had sacrificed everything for her. The fear in her chest hardened into something sharp and unbreakable. We are not losing this land, Clara vowed, her voice trembling with absolute, unwavering conviction. And he is never touching me again. We will get that money, Silas. I don't care what it takes. Silas looked down at her, seeing the fire in her emerald eyes. For the first time since his sister died, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever. Hope. The morning after Sheriff Cobb delivered Elias Gentry's extortionate ultimatum, the Broken Spur Ranch felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb awaiting its occupants. $800 in 3 months. It was a sum that could buy a small town, let alone save a failing homestead. Silas Thorne was awake long before the sun breached the eastern horizon. When Clara emerged from behind the canvas partition he had rigged for her privacy, She found him in the center of the cabin, methodically checking the action on his Winchester and packing saddlebags with a grim, frightening efficiency. Ropes of thick braided rawhide were coiled on the floor, alongside heavy leather gloves, a tin of coffee, and a sack of salted beef. Clara tied her shortened silk skirt around her waist, the fabric now permanently stained with soot and earth. "What are you doing?" Silas didn't look up from the leather strap he was oiling. "Packing. I'm riding out in an hour." "To where?" Clara's heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. For a fleeting, terrifying second, she thought he was leaving her, abandoning the ranch and the impossible debt. "Devil's Canyon," Silas grunted, pulling a heavy wool blanket from his cot and rolling it tight. "It's a stretch of badlands 20 miles north, a labyrinth of red rock and dead ends. There's a herd of wild mustangs that run through the lower basin, untouched, unbroken stock. The U.S. Cavalry out of Fort Laramie is paying top dollar for sound remounts, $40 a head. If I can trap 20 of them and break them enough to take a saddle, we have our $800. Clara did the mental arithmetic, her eyes widening. "You intend to trap 20 wild horses? Alone?" Silas finally looked at her. The storm gray of his eyes was as unyielding as iron. "I don't have a choice, Clara. It's the only contract that pays enough fast enough. I'll be gone 2, maybe 3 weeks. I've loaded the shotgun. It's under your cot. You keep the doors barred. You don't open it for anyone, not even if they're bleeding to death on the porch. If Gentry's men come snooping, you shoot through the wood." He slung the heavy saddlebags over his shoulder and moved toward the door. "I'm coming with you," Clara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a ringing clarity that stopped Silas dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, his broad shoulders filling the door frame, casting a long shadow across the scrubbed floorboards. "No, you are not," Silas said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Devil's Canyon isn't a place for a greenhorn. The heat bounces off the canyon walls and cooks you alive during the day, and the temperature drops below freezing at night. There are rattlesnakes, flash floods, and horses that will trample you into dust if you stand in the wrong place. You stay here." "And do what?" Clara stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She tilted her chin up to meet his glare. "Wait for Gentry's men to burn this cabin down with me inside it? Wait for a rider to come tell me you were crushed to death by a wild stallion in some godforsaken ravine? You need someone to watch your back. You need someone to manage the camp, to keep the fires going, to hold the ropes." "Clara, I am not a fragile porcelain doll from Boston anymore, Silas," she interrupted, her voice trembling with a fierce, latent power. She held up her hands, displaying the raw, healing blisters and the calluses forming on her palms. "You bought my freedom. You gave up this ranch for me. I am not going to sit in a cabin and knit while you die trying to buy it back. We are in this together. I am coming with you." Silas stared down at her. He saw the jut of her jaw, the rigid line of her spine, and the emerald fire in her eyes. He knew he could physically force her to stay, could lock the cabin door from the outside. But looking at her now, he realized that breaking her spirit would be a greater sin than taking her into danger. A heavy sigh rattled in his chest. He reached up and tipped the brim of his Stetson down. "Saddle the speckled mare. Pack whatever warm clothes you have. If you complain once about the cold, the heat, or the blisters, I'm putting you on a stagecoach to Omaha myself. Do you understand?" "Perfectly," Clara said, a victorious, breathless smile breaking across her face. The ride to Devil's Canyon was a grueling trek through unforgiving geography. The rolling plains of sagebrush gradually gave way to jagged, violent upthrusts of ochre and rust-colored sandstone. By midday, the sun was a punishing hammer, beating down on their shoulders. Clara's thighs burned from gripping the saddle, and dust coated the inside of her mouth, tasting of copper and age. True to Silas's warning, the heat was suffocating, trapped between the towering walls of the canyon as they descended into the labyrinth. They made camp in a narrow offshoot of the main gorge near a shallow, muddy creek that trickled over smooth river stones. Silas wasted no time. For the next 3 days, they engaged in a brutal, exhausting war of attrition against the landscape. Their strategy was simple in theory, near impossible in execution. Silas had identified a blind box canyon, a cul-de-sac of sheer rock walls with only one narrow entrance. Together, they labored from dawn until dusk, building a wing fence out of dead scrub oak, thorny brush, and heavy stones, creating a funnel that would guide the wild mustangs into the natural trap. Clara discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. Her hands bled, her back screamed in agony, and her face was sunburned to a crisp. Yet she never uttered a single word of complaint. She dragged heavy branches, her breath coming in ragged gasps, matching Silas's relentless pace. When the sun dipped below the canyon rim, and the air turned instantly painfully cold, it was Clara who built the smokeless fires deep in the alcoves to avoid alerting the herd. It was Clara who cooked the salted beef and brewed the bitter coffee that kept them awake. And it was Clara who stood the first watch every night. On the 4th night, Silas woke near midnight to relieve her. He found Clara sitting on a flat boulder near the mouth of their camp, his heavy Winchester resting across her knees. The collar of his spare canvas coat was turned up around her ears, drowning her small frame, but her posture was violently alert. Silas stepped softly into the moonlight. He didn't announce his presence, but Clara didn't flinch. She had learned to listen to the wind, to distinguish the scrape of his boots from the scurry of a coyote. "Go to sleep, Clara," Silas murmured, his voice rumbling low in the quiet canyon. "I'll take the watch." Clara didn't look at him, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. "I saw dust moving on the northern ridge about an hour ago. Just a cloud, but it was moving fast. The herd?" Silas moved to stand beside her, his gaze following her pointing finger. "Likely. They're coming down to find water. Tomorrow we spring the trap." He looked down at her. In the pale silver light of the moon, the dirt on her cheek looked like a shadow, and her eyes were vast, dark pools. The refined, terrified girl from the Golden Rose Saloon was entirely gone. In her place sat a woman of the frontier, forged in dust and resilience. A strange physical ache bloomed in the center of Silas's chest. It was a terrifying mixture of profound respect and an undeniable consuming hunger. "You did good today," Silas said quietly. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. Clara finally looked up at him. The corner of her lips lifted in a tired, genuine smile that hit Silas like a physical blow. "So did you, Cowboy. But if you make me eat salted beef one more time, I might use this rifle on you instead of Gentry." A low, rare chuckle rumbled from Silas's chest. It was a sound rusty with disuse, but it warmed the freezing canyon air. He reached out, acting entirely on a sudden, reckless instinct, and tucked a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. His rough fingertips brushed against her cold cheek. The air between them seemed to suddenly thin. Clara's breath hitched, her eyes widening slightly as she looked up into his shadowed face. The exhaustion melted away, replaced by a sudden electric awareness. She leaned, just a fraction of an inch, into his touch. Silas's jaw clenched. The urge to lean down, to press his mouth against hers, and taste the stubborn, beautiful fire in her, was overwhelming. But the ghosts in his head and the looming threat of the debt screamed at him to pull back. He had nothing to offer her but dirt, danger, and a target on her back. He abruptly dropped his hand, stepping away and clearing his throat. "Get some sleep, Clara. Tomorrow is going to be hell." He walked to the edge of the camp, turning his back to her, leaving Clara staring after him, her cheek burning where his fingers had rested, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. The trap was sprung at high noon. The heat in Devil's Canyon was absolute, baking the red rock until the air shimmered with mirages. Silas sat atop his roan gelding, hidden in the brush on the western ridge, while Clara was positioned on the speckled mare near the funnel's mouth, a heavy coiled bullwhip in her gloved hands. When the herd of mustangs, 24 magnificent untamed beasts of roan, buckskin, and bay, came trotting down the dry wash toward the creek, Silas moved. He spurred his horse, breaking over the ridge with a deafening, terrifying yell, firing his six-shooter into the air. The canyon erupted into chaos. The mustangs panicked, their hooves striking the hard earth like rolling thunder. Driven by Silas's relentless pursuit, the lead stallion bolted down the wash, directly toward the funnel of brush and stone Clara and Silas had built. Clara's heart hammered in her throat as the mass of muscle, dust, and raw power charged toward her. The ground physically shook. For a second, the lead stallion slowed, sensing the trap, his wild eyes rolling. He looked ready to pivot and bolt for the open desert. "Yeah!" Clara screamed, her voice tearing from her throat. She stood in the stirrups and cracked the bullwhip with everything she had. The sharp crack echoed like a cannon shot off the canyon walls. The stallion flinched away from the sound, abandoning his escape route and plunging headlong into the blind box canyon. The rest of the herd blindly followed. Silas rode in right on their heels, spinning his horse in a tight circle and leaping from the saddle. Together, he and Clara hauled the heavy, pre-built gate of interlocking logs across the narrow entrance, securing it with thick chains. They had them. 22 head of wild mustangs trapped in a high-walled stone prison. Silas slumped against the wooden gate, his chest heaving, his face caked in sweat and red dust. He looked at Clara, who was leaning over her saddle horn, breathing just as hard, her eyes wide with adrenaline and disbelief. "We did it!" Clara gasped, a laugh bubbling up from her throat. "Silas, we did it! That's the money! That's the ranch!" Silas pushed off the gate, a rare, triumphant grin splitting his weathered face. He walked toward her, reaching out to grasp the mare's bridle, his eyes shining. "You held the line, Clara. I couldn't have done it without—" The wind changed. It didn't just shift, it dropped completely, leaving a sudden, suffocating vacuum in the canyon. The hairs on the back of Silas's neck stood up. The sky to the west, beyond the canyon rim, wasn't blue anymore. It was a bruised, sickly purple, transitioning rapidly into a churning, towering wall of absolute black, a haboob, a Wyoming dust storm of apocalyptic proportions. "Get off the horse!" Silas roared, the triumph instantly vanishing from his face. "Clara, get down now!" But the warning came a second too late. The vanguard of the storm slammed into the canyon with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked, a deafening, high-pitched howl that drowned out all other sound. A blinding wall of stinging red sand swept over them, reducing visibility to zero in a heartbeat. Inside the trap, the mustangs went completely insane. The panicked horses shrieked, rearing and kicking, throwing themselves against the rock walls and the wooden gate. The noise was apocalyptic. Clara's speckled mare, normally docile, was overwhelmed by the sudden sensory assault. A violent gust of wind tore a large branch from the canyon rim, sending it crashing into the brush just feet from the mare's hooves. The horse screamed in terror and reared violently. "Silas!" Clara cried out, clinging desperately to the saddle horn as she was thrown backward. The mare bolted blindly, not toward the open wash, but toward the jagged, unstable eastern wall of the canyon. Silas lunged for the reins, diving through the blinding dust, but his fingers only brushed the leather before the horse vanished into the swirling brown chaos. "Clara!" Silas screamed, drawing his bandana over his mouth and running blindly into the storm. He found the mare 50 yards away, riderless, kicking wildly at a steep, crumbling embankment of loose shale. Silas's heart stopped. The earth near the embankment had collapsed, forming a jagged, gaping fissure in the ground. A sinkhole masked by years of dry brush, opened violently by the storm and the horse's panicked hooves. Silas dropped to his knees at the edge of the abyss. The wind howled, whipping sand into his eyes, blinding him. "Clara!" he roared into the darkness of the hole. Nothing. The memory of his sister's lifeless face flashed behind his eyelids, visceral and paralyzing. Too late again. "No!" Silas growled, a feral, desperate sound. He didn't think. He didn't secure a rope. He simply threw himself over the edge of the fissure, sliding blindly down the steep, jagged chute of loose rock and darkness. He tumbled violently, rocks tearing at his clothes and bruising his ribs. He fell for what felt like an eternity before hitting a steep incline of soft, damp earth, rolling until he slammed into a solid stone wall. Silas lay there for a second, the wind howling far above him like a distant beast. It was pitch black. The air here was shockingly cold, and it smelled distinctly of wet stone and deep earth. "Clara?" he choked out, pushing himself up on shaking arms. "Silas?" The voice was weak, trembling, and came from only a few feet away. Relief hit Silas so hard he thought he might vomit. He scrambled through the darkness on his hands and knees, his hands blindly sweeping over the cold stone until his fingers brushed against the soft fabric of a canvas coat. "Clara, I've got you. I'm here," he breathed, his large hands frantically checking her arms, her shoulders, her face for broken bones. "I'm all right," she gasped, her hands gripping his forearms tightly in the dark. "I slid. I didn't fall straight down. Silas, where are we? It's freezing." Silas reached into his vest pocket, his fingers trembling as he pulled out a brass match safe. He struck a match against the stone. The small yellow flare illuminated the darkness, and both of them stopped breathing. They weren't in a simple sinkhole. They were sitting on a wide, sloping ledge of limestone inside a massive, cavernous subterranean dome. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like jagged teeth, but that wasn't what paralyzed them. 10 feet below their ledge, filling the bottom of the cavern, was a rushing, crystalline river. It was massive, fast-moving, and entirely hidden from the arid, sun-baked world above. The sound of it, previously masked by the storm, now filled the cavern with a continuous, powerful roar. The match burned down to Silas's fingertips, and he dropped it with a hiss, plunging them back into darkness. But the image was burned into their retinas. "Silas," Clara whispered, her voice echoing faintly off the cavern walls, her mind spinning with terrifying clarity. Water. In the middle of the worst drought in a decade. A continuous underground river. Silas sat back on his heels, the puzzle pieces clicking together with sickening precision. The broken spur borders Devil's Canyon. The land title. The original deeds. My father told me the property lines extended deep under the foothills. "Gentry doesn't want your ranch because he likes the view, Silas," Clara said, her grip tightening on his arms. "The Pacific Union Railroad is surveying the territory for a new line. They need water for the steam engines. Whoever controls a limitless water supply in this territory will become richer than God." "Your uncle," Silas realized, the horror dawning on him. Arthur Vance was a gambler, but he used to work as a surveyor. He didn't have an accident. He found this. He found the water, and Gentry killed him to silence him, then used his gambling debts to secure you, just to tie up any loose ends regarding the Vance estate. They sat in the pitch black, the deafening roar of the underground river echoing the magnitude of their discovery. It wasn't just a debt anymore. It was a conspiracy, a murder, and a fortune worth killing over 100 times. Clara began to shiver violently. The adrenaline was crashing, and the ambient temperature of the cavern was drawing the heat from her bruised body. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably. Silas felt her shaking. The realization of what they had just uncovered was eclipsed by a much more immediate, primal truth. She was alive. She had fallen into the earth, and she had survived. "Come here," Silas commanded roughly. He pulled her blindly into his lap. Clara didn't resist. She collapsed against his broad chest, burying her face in the crook of his neck. Silas wrapped his massive arms around her, folding his duster over her shivering frame, burying his face in her dust-caked hair. For 5 years, Silas Thorne had held the world at arm's length, punishing himself, believing he was a poison to anyone he cared about. But sitting in the dark, feeling Clara's rapid heartbeat against his chest, the iron control he had maintained finally catastrophically snapped. He didn't want to protect her from the world anymore. He wanted to claim her in spite of it. Silas shifted his grip, one hand tangling in her loose hair, tilting her face up in the dark. Clara gasped softly as she felt his warm breath ghost over her lips. "Silas," she whispered, her voice a fragile, desperate plea. He didn't answer. He brought his mouth down on hers. It wasn't a gentle, polite kiss. It was an explosion of pent-up terror, relief, and a starving, feral hunger. Silas kissed her like he was drowning and she was the only air left in the world. His lips were rough, demanding, tasting of dust and rain. Clara's mind went blank. A shockwave of pure heat erupted from her core, chasing away the cavern's chill. She let out a soft, helpless sound, opening her mouth to him, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer, deeper. She kissed him back with a fierce, reckless desperation, pouring all of her fear, her stubborn defiance, and her unspoken love into the connection. They clung to each other in the pitch-black abyss, surrounded by the roar of the hidden river. Two broken people who had finally found the one thing worth fighting for. The debt, Elias Gentry, the wild mustangs. It all faded away. In the dark of the cavern, Silas Thorne finally let go of his ghosts, entirely consumed by the woman in his arms. The ascent from the subterranean cavern was a brutal, scraping ordeal of torn fingernails and bruised knees. It took Silas and Clara 3 agonizing hours to navigate the collapsed shale embankment, moving blindly in the pitch black until the faint, dusty light of the canyon's slit appeared above them. When they finally hauled themselves over the jagged lip of the sinkhole, they collapsed onto the hard earth, chest heaving, lungs burning. The haboob had passed, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. A thick layer of fine red dust coated the world, painting the canyon in the color of dried blood. Silas pushed himself up onto his elbows. His duster was torn, his knuckles bleeding, but his storm-gray eyes immediately sought Clara. She lay on her back a few feet away, her shortened silk skirt ruined beyond repair, her dark hair a tangled, dust-caked mess. She looked over at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The memory of the kiss they had shared in the terrifying darkness of the cavern hung between them. A heavy, palpable thing. It hadn't been a moment of mere comfort. It had been a raw, feral claiming that neither of them could take back. Nor did they want to. "The horses," Silas rasped, his voice raw from the dust. He forced himself to his feet, offering her a large, calloused hand. Clara took it. His grip was an anchor. "Are they gone?" "We'll find out." They trekked back to the blind box canyon, every muscle screaming in protest. A profound wave of relief washed over them when they saw the heavy wooden gate still intact. Inside, 22 wild mustangs milled about, exhausted and spooked, but trapped. They had their fortune. They had the means to pay off Elias Gentry. More importantly, they had Gentry's secret. The drive back to the Broken Spur took 2 grueling days. They moved at a punishing pace, driving the unbroken remuda ahead of them. Along the way, they passed the tiny, windswept rail stop of Oakhaven. Silas rode ahead to secure water for the herd, leaving Clara near the small telegraph office. Clara stared at the wooden sign. Her uncle had been a scoundrel, but he had kept meticulous records, and Clara possessed a flawless memory. She remembered the names of his old surveying contacts, specifically a federal magistrate in Denver, who despised Gentry's growing monopoly. With the last silver dollar she possessed hidden in her boot, she marched into the office and drafted a wire. She didn't just report the underground river. She accused Elias Gentry of the murder of Arthur Vance and the extortion of the Broken Spur. She demanded federal intervention. She didn't tell Silas. He had enough weight on his broad shoulders. This was her burden, her battle line drawn in the sand. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the Broken Spur, the sun was sinking, casting long, skeletal shadows across the plains. Silas pulled his roan to a sudden, violent halt. He held up a clenched fist. Clara instantly yanked her speckled mare's reins, freezing in place. "What is it?" she whispered. her hand instinctively dropping to the stock of the Winchester in her scabbard. Silas didn't answer. His eyes scanned the property with the lethal intensity of a hunting wolf. The cabin looked untouched. The sagging barn stood silent, but the air felt wrong. The quiet was too deep, too absolute. "Stay behind me," Silas ordered low in his throat. They drove the mustangs down into the heavy timber corral, securing the thick iron latch. Silas dismounted smoothly, his rifle already in his hands. He moved toward the water trough near the barn. Clara slid from her saddle and followed, her boots crunching softly on the dry earth. Silas crouched by the trough. He reached out with the barrel of his rifle, dipping the steel into the water. When he pulled it out, the water didn't drip clean. It clung to the metal with a thick, sickly, iridescent sheen. "Arsenic," Silas growled, his jaw clenching so hard the bone turned white. "Gentry's men, they poisoned the water." Clara covered her mouth, horror turning her blood to ice. "If we had let the mustangs drink, they'd be dead in an hour, and so would we." Silas stood up, pivoting sharply as his gaze swept the tree line. "He knows. Cobb must have had someone tracking us. Gentry knows we went for the mustangs. He knows if we sell them to the cavalry tomorrow, his legal claim to this land vanishes. He isn't waiting for the 3 months to expire, Clara. He's going to break us now." The siege had begun. That night, the broken spur transformed from a homestead into a fortress. Silas spent hours hauling clean water from a hidden spring a mile away, carrying it bucket by agonizing bucket to keep the mustangs hydrated. Clara boarded up the windows with heavy pine planks, leaving only narrow slits for rifle barrels. The psychological warfare started just after midnight. Clara was sitting by the cold hearth. They dared not light a fire and silhouette themselves, when a sharp snap echoed from the southern pasture. Silas was at the window in a heartbeat, peering through the slit. "They're cutting the barbed wire, letting the few head of cattle I have left wander off into the Badlands." "Shoot them," Clara urged, her fingers white-knuckled around her revolver. "Too far. They're staying out of range, just playing with us, trying to bleed us dry and exhaust us before they make a real move." For the next 48 hours, sleep became a mythical concept. The tension in the cabin was a living, breathing thing, wrapping around their throats and squeezing. Every shadow was a gunman. Every rustle of wind was a boot step. They took turns standing guard. When Clara slept, it was in short, restless bursts on the cot, her hand resting on her gun. But watching Silas, Clara realized something profound. He wasn't afraid. He was exhausted. He was angry. But there was no fear in his storm-gray eyes. There was only a grim, terrifying acceptance. He patrolled the perimeter of the cabin like a chained dog, his body a coiled spring. On the third afternoon of the siege, a single rifle shot cracked through the heavy, stagnant air. A bullet shattered the ceramic coffee pot sitting on the stove, sending shards of porcelain and cold coffee exploding across the room. Clara shrieked, dropping to the floorboards. Silas dove across the room, covering her body with his massive frame, burying her face into his chest. They lay there for a long minute, waiting for a volley that never came. Just a single, taunting shot to prove that Gentry's men were watching, and they rarely missed. Silas slowly pushed himself up, his hands hovering over Clara's shoulders. "You hit?" "No," she gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up at him. The protective fury in his eyes was blinding. "Silas." "I won't let them touch you," he swore, his voice a ragged whisper. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a splatter of cold coffee from her cheek. "I will burn this entire territory to the ground before I let a single one of those bastards put a hand on you." Clara stared into his face. The realization didn't arrive like a thunderbolt. It settled into her bones with the quiet, absolute certainty of a sunrise. She loved him. She didn't just respect him, didn't just owe him her life. She loved the scarred, broken, fiercely honorable man who had sacrificed everything for a stranger in a saloon. She reached up and covered his hand with hers, pressing his palm against her cheek. I know, but you need to understand something, Silas Thorne. I am not running. I am not hiding. This is our land. If they want it, they will have to go through both of us. Silas closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. For a moment, amidst the shattered porcelain and the looming threat of death, they simply breathed each other in. They were besieged, outgunned, and outmanned. But as Silas held her, he realized Gentry had made a fatal miscalculation. Gentry thought he was fighting a man desperate to keep his dirt. He didn't realize he was fighting a man who had finally found his soul. The sun dipped below the jagged horizon, bleeding crimson and bruised purple across the Wyoming sky. Tomorrow morning at dawn, the quartermaster from Fort Laramie would arrive with a detachment of soldiers to inspect and purchase the mustangs. Tomorrow morning, Silas would have $800 in cash. Tomorrow, Elias Gentry's iron grip on the broken spur would be legally severed, which meant tonight was the crucible. Gentry would not let the sun rise on those horses. The interior of the cabin was pitch black. Silas had extinguished the lanterns an hour ago. The heavy oak door was barred with a thick crossbeam. Every weapon they owned was loaded and laid out on the wooden table. The Winchester repeater, a double-barreled scattergun, Clara's Colt revolver, and 2 extra bandoliers of heavy brass cartridges. The silence of the plains was oppressive, thick, and suffocating. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was the breathless anticipation of a predator waiting to strike. Clara sat on the edge of the cot, the Colt resting in her lap. Her eyes had adjusted to the dark, tracking Silas's large silhouette as he paced the length of the cabin, checking the window slits for the 100th time. Sit down, Silas, Clara whispered into the dark. Pacing won't make them come any faster. Silas stopped. He stood in the center of the room for a long moment before slowly walking over to the cot. He didn't sit beside her. He sank to the floorboards at her feet, resting his forearms on his knees, his broad back leaning heavily against the edge of the mattress. Clara hesitated for only a second before reaching out in the dark. She let her fingers comb through his thick, unruly hair, lightly massaging his scalp. She felt the rigid, coiled tension in his neck muscles slightly give way under her touch. He let out a long, ragged exhale, tilting his head back to lean against her thigh. I never thought I'd have something to lose again, Silas murmured, his voice so quiet it barely disturbed the air. Clara's hand paused. The ranch? No, Silas corrected softly. He turned his head, looking up at her in the shadows. The dirt is just dirt. I fought for it because it was all I had left of my family. It was an anchor to keep me from drifting into a bottle and never coming out. But you... He reached up, his rough fingers wrapping gently around her wrist. You made me want to actually live. Not just survive. Live. Clara's chest tightened, a fierce ache blooming behind her ribs. You saved me, Silas. In every way a person can be saved. I pulled you out of a saloon, he countered, his voice thickening with a vulnerable, desperate honesty he had never shown another living soul. But I brought you into a war. I have nothing to offer you, Clara. I'm a broke cowboy with a target on my back. You deserve a house in Boston. You deserve silk dresses and a man who doesn't sleep with a rifle in his hands. Don't, Clara said fiercely, sliding off the cot to kneel on the floorboards directly in front of him. She grabbed his face with both hands, forcing him to look into her eyes. Don't you dare insult me by telling me what I deserve. I know what men in suits and silk ties are capable of. My uncle sold me for a gambling debt. I don't want a house in Boston. I want the man who spent his last dime to buy my freedom. I want the man who jumped into a sinkhole in a dust storm to find me. I want you, Silas. Only you. Silas stared at her, his storm-gray eyes wide, reflecting the faint starlight bleeding through the cracks in the wood. A physical shudder ripped through his massive frame. The wall he had built around his heart, the fortress of guilt and isolation he had maintained for 5 agonizing years, didn't just crumble. It was obliterated by the absolute, unwavering devotion in her voice. He didn't speak. Words were utterly insufficient. Silas moved, surging forward and wrapping his heavy arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of lye soap, dust, and the sweet, intoxicating essence that was purely her. Clara gasped, her arms immediately wrapping around his broad shoulders. She held him as tightly as she could, anchoring him to the earth. When Silas finally pulled back, his eyes were burning with a fierce, starving intensity. He framed her face with his calloused hands, his thumbs gently sweeping over her cheekbones. "Clara," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. He kissed her. It wasn't like the frantic, adrenaline-fueled collision in the cavern. This was slow, deliberate, and devastatingly tender. It was a claiming. His lips moved over hers with a deep, reverent worship, savoring the soft, pliant heat of her mouth. Clara melted against him, a soft moan escaping her throat. She opened to him entirely, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. The fear of the impending attack, the looming shadow of Elias Gentry, it all dissolved into the heavy, heated darkness of the cabin. There was only the scrape of his stubble against her chin, the solid, unyielding heat of his chest, and the desperate, rhythmic thud of his heart against hers. Silas effortlessly lifted her, standing up and laying her back onto the narrow cot. He followed her down, his heavy frame blanketing hers, supporting his weight on his forearms to keep from crushing her. He kissed her jaw, the sensitive skin just below her ear, trailing fire down the column of her throat. "Are you sure?" Silas whispered against her collarbone, his breathing ragged, his massive body trembling with the Herculean effort to hold himself back. "If we don't survive tomorrow—" "Then I want to belong to you tonight," Clara interrupted, her hands pulling at the buttons of his shirt. Her emerald eyes were wide, dark, and filled with an absolute, breathtaking certainty. "Make me yours, Silas. Make me forget everything else." The last shred of Silas's restraint vanished. The hours that followed were a blur of skin, heat, and desperate whispers in the dark. There was no hesitation, no pretense. Every touch was an unspoken vow. Every breath was a promise. Silas loved her with a slow, agonizing thoroughness, treating her scarred, blistered body like it was the most precious thing he had ever held. And Clara loved him back with a fierce, unyielding passion, stripping away the hardened cowboy to find the deeply loving, honorable man beneath. When they finally lay still, tangled together beneath the heavy wool blanket, the cabin was eerily quiet. Silas held her tightly against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. Clara listened to the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of peace. Whatever happened tomorrow, they had won tonight. Exhaustion finally claimed her, pulling her down into a deep, dreamless sleep. She didn't know how much time had passed. Clara's eyes snapped open. The cabin was still pitch black. The silence was still absolute. Silas's arm was heavy and warm across her waist. But something was wrong. Her lungs felt tight. Her throat scratched. She lay perfectly still, her senses straining in the dark. She listened for the crunch of boots on gravel. She waited for the sharp crack of a rifle shot breaking the glass. She waited for the sound of Gentry's men kicking in the door. But there was no gunfire. There were no shouts. There was only a faint crackling sound, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. And then she smelled it, acrid, choking, the sharp, unmistakable stench of burning pine and scorched earth. Clara bolted upright in the bed, her heart stopping cold in her chest. Gentry hadn't come to shoot them. He had bypassed the barricaded cabin entirely. "Silas!" Clara screamed, violently shaking his shoulders. The faint orange glow of flames began to leak through the cracks in the window boards. Gentry had set the barn on fire. He was burning the mustangs alive. "Silas!" Clara's scream tore through the pitch-black cabin. Silas was awake and moving before his eyes were fully open. The primal, suffocating smell of wood smoke hit his lungs like a physical blow. He lunged from the cot, grabbing his Winchester and his heavy canvas duster in one fluid motion. Through the narrow slits in the boarded-up windows, the world outside was glowing with a horrific, violently shifting orange light. "The barn," Silas rasped, his voice rough with sleep and sudden absolute terror. "They fired the barn. The mustangs are inside." It was a death sentence. Not just for the 22 magnificent wild horses trapped behind heavy timber doors, but for the broken spur itself. Without the remuda to sell to the cavalry at dawn, the $800 would never materialize. Gentry wasn't just burning wood. He was incinerating their freedom. The frantic, high-pitched shrieks of terrified horses pierced the night, a sound so agonizing it made Clara's blood run cold. "I have to let them out," Silas said, violently racking the lever of his Winchester to chamber a round. He moved toward the heavy oak door, his storm-gray eyes flat and lethal. "Silas, no!" Clara grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his rigid muscles. "It's an ambush. The second you step off this porch, they'll cut you down." "If I don't open those doors, 22 animals burn alive, Clara." Silas looked down at her, his expression heartbreakingly resolved. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it until you hear my voice." He didn't wait for her to argue. He threw the heavy crossbeam off the iron brackets, kicked the door open, and launched himself into the nightmare. The heat hit them instantly, blistering and absolute. The barn was a roaring inferno, flames licking 50 feet into the night sky, casting long, demonic shadows across the dirt yard. "Thorns out!" a voice shouted from the tree line. Gunfire erupted. The darkness at the edge of the property lit up with the staccato muzzle flashes of a half-dozen rifles. Bullets chewed into the dirt around Silas's boots, splintering the wooden posts of the porch. Clara didn't bar the door. She threw herself onto her stomach on the porch floorboards, shoving the barrel of her Winchester through the railing. She didn't aim at shadows. She aimed at the muzzle flashes. She squeezed the trigger, fired, racked the lever, fired again. Her shoulder screamed in protest, but the suppressive fire forced 2 of Gentry's men to duck for cover, giving Silas the precious seconds he needed. Silas ran through the hail of lead, his long legs eating up the distance to the burning barn. The heat singed his hair and eyebrows. He threw his shoulder against the massive wooden crossbar holding the barn doors shut, grunting with a Herculean effort as the superheated wood burned his palms. With a deafening crack, the bar gave way. Silas threw the doors wide open and dove into the dirt, just as the panicked remuda surged forward. A tidal wave of terrified, smoke-blackened mustangs exploded from the burning structure. They thundered into the yard, a chaotic mass of raw muscle and blind panic, their hooves churning the dirt into a blinding dust cloud. Silas pushed himself up onto his knees, coughing violently, raising his rifle to lay down cover fire toward the tree line. Crack! The sound of the shot was lost in the roar of the fire, but the impact was devastating. Silas's body jerked violently. The Winchester slipped from his grasp as he was thrown backward into the dust, clutching his right shoulder. Blood, dark and slick, instantly saturated the canvas of his coat. "Silas!" Clara's voice shredded her throat. She didn't think. The refined Boston lady was dead. Only the frontier woman remained. She dropped her rifle, scrambled to her feet, and sprinted off the porch directly into the line of fire. Bullets whizzed past her head like angry hornets. She threw herself into the dirt beside Silas, grabbing him by the heavy collar of his duster. "Get up!" she screamed, hauling his massive frame upward with a strength born of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. "Silas, look at me! Get up!" Silas gritted his teeth, his face pale beneath the soot. He planted his boots, using his good arm to push off the ground, leaning heavily against her small frame. Together they stumbled back toward the cabin, the stampeding mustangs inadvertently providing a chaotic, moving shield between them and the tree line. They collapsed onto the porch, just as a bullet shattered the door frame inches from Clara's head. She dragged him over the threshold, kicking the heavy oak door shut and slamming the crossbeam down. The cabin was instantly plunged back into suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the orange light bleeding through the window slats. Silas lay on the floorboards, his breathing ragged and shallow, his hand pressed hard against the gaping wound just below his collarbone. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, her hands slick with his blood as she applied desperate pressure. "You're all right. It went clean through. You're going to be all right." "Clara," Silas choked out, his hand reaching up to weakly grip her wrist. "The horses?" "They're out," she promised, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. "They're out." Heavy boots stomped onto the wooden planks of the porch. "Well, well," Elias Gentry's smooth, venomous voice drifted through the splintered door. "Looks like the hero took a fall. Open the door, Miss Vance. The game is over." "Break it down," Gentry ordered lazily. Two heavy impacts shuddered through the oak door. The iron brackets holding the crossbeam groaned in protest. The wood splintered. Clara looked down at Silas. He was bleeding too fast, his storm-gray eyes losing focus. He tried to reach for his Colt, but his right arm was completely useless. "I love you," Clara whispered, pressing her blood-stained lips to his forehead. "I told you, they go through me." She stood up, her eyes landing on the heavy wooden crate sitting just to the left of the doorway. It was Silas's blasting powder, the highly volatile explosives he used for clearing stubborn stumps in the lower pasture. He had brought it onto the porch 3 days ago to keep it out of the damp and dragged it inside when the siege began. The door buckled under a third massive blow. The crossbeam snapped. Elias Gentry stepped over the threshold, the roaring fire of the barn illuminating him from behind. He was a wealthy man dressed in a tailored wool suit entirely out of place in the dirt and blood of the frontier. Behind him stood Sheriff Cobb, his shotgun leveled at Clara's chest. "A valiant effort, Thorne," Gentry sneered, stepping carefully over the debris to look down at Silas. He pulled a folded legal document from his breast pocket. "But ultimately pointless. The horses are scattered to the wind. You have no money. You have no blood left to bleed. It's done." Gentry turned his cold, reptilian gaze to Clara. "Sign the transfer of deed, Miss Vance. Sign it, and I'll let Cobb here fetch a doctor for your cowboy. Refuse, and you can watch him die before I drag you back to Cheyenne to work off your uncle's debts in a place far less forgiving than a saloon back room." Clara stood perfectly still in the center of the cabin. She didn't weep. She didn't beg. She looked at Gentry, her emerald eyes burning with a terrifying, absolute calm. "You killed my uncle," Clara said, her voice eerily steady. "You poisoned our water. You burned our livelihood. You think a piece of paper makes you a king, Mr. Gentry. But out here, paper burns." Without breaking eye contact, Clara reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the lit kerosene lantern sitting on the table. Gentry frowned, taking a half-step back. "Put that down, you stupid girl." "My name," she said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper, "is Clara Thorne." She didn't throw the lantern at Gentry. She hurled it straight down, directly onto the wooden crate of blasting powder at Gentry's feet. The glass shattered. The kerosene ignited instantly. "Run!" Cobb screamed. The explosion was apocalyptic. A blinding white flash vaporized the shadows, followed a millisecond later by a concussive shockwave that defied description. The front wall of the cabin blew outward in a hurricane of splintered wood, nails, and fire. The blast threw Clara backward over the cot. Silas was shielded by the heavy oak table, but the sheer force of the sound ruptured the air, leaving a high-pitched, deafening ring in its wake. Outside, the explosion blew the remaining corral fencing into toothpicks. The mustangs, which had been trapped in the yard in a panicked frenzy, were driven into absolute mindless terror by the blast. They stampeded directly over the porch, a tidal wave of hooves crashing through the tree line where Gentry's men were taking cover. Screams of terrified men were instantly crushed beneath thousands of pounds of fleeing wild muscle. Inside the ruined cabin, Clara pushed herself up through the settling dust and smoke. Her ears were bleeding, and the world was spinning violently, but she forced herself to her feet. She scooped up her Winchester from the floorboards, racking the lever with a sharp, definitive clack. She stumbled through the gaping hole where the front door used to be. The porch was gone. Sheriff Cobb was nowhere to be seen, having either fled into the night or been trampled by the herd. But Elias Gentry was still there. He was lying on his back in the dirt, his tailored suit in tatters, coughing up blood and ash. He stared up at the burning sky in dazed shock, the wind knocked completely out of his lungs. Clara walked down the splintered steps. She didn't hesitate. She placed the heavy steel toe of her boot squarely on Gentry's chest, pinning him to the earth, and jammed the scorching hot barrel of her Winchester directly under his chin. The smell of singed flesh and hair drifted up as Gentry gasped, his eyes wide with sudden paralyzing terror. He looked up at the woman he had tried to break and saw the Grim Reaper staring back. "The deed," Clara commanded, extending her blood-slicked hand. Gentry's hands shook violently as he reached into his ruined coat, pulling out the folded mortgage note. He held it up. Clara snatched it from his fingers. She pulled a stub of charcoal from her apron pocket, the same charcoal she used to mark the calendar on the cabin wall, and tossed it onto his chest. "Right!" she snarled, pressing the rifle barrel a fraction of an inch deeper into his throat. "Right, paid in full, lien released, and sign your name." It won't be legal in charcoal," Gentry wheezed, blood bubbling on his lips. Clara pressed her thumb to the deep bleeding gash on her forehead, smearing her own blood across the bottom of the parchment. "Then sign it in blood. Write it, Elias, or I swear to God I will paint this dirt with what's left of your brains." Trembling, broken, and completely defeated, Gentry took the charcoal. Against the flickering light of his own arson, the tyrant of the territory hastily scribbled the release of the Broken Spur Ranch, signing his name in a jagged, panicked scrawl. Clara snatched the paper back. She looked down at him, her chest heaving, the urge to pull the trigger, fighting a violent war with her humanity. Slowly, she lifted the rifle. She didn't shoot him. Leaving him broken in the dirt was a far greater humiliation. She turned her back on Elias Gentry and walked back into the ruins of her home to save the man she loved. The rain began just before dawn. It didn't come as a gentle drizzle, but as a torrential, cleansing deluge. The heavy sheets of water hissed against the smoldering ruins of the barn, quenching the flames and washing the thick, cloying ash from the Wyoming sky. The air, previously thick with gunpowder and death, now smelled sharply of wet sage and wet earth. Inside the half-destroyed cabin, the world had shrunk to a single quiet corner, untouched by the blast. Silas sat propped against the remaining log wall, his breathing shallow but steady. The bleeding had stopped. Clara knelt beside him, a bucket of clean rainwater at her knee. Across her lap lay the emerald silk dress she had worn on the day he bought her life in the Golden Rose Saloon. With quiet, methodical precision, Clara gripped the hem of the silk and tore the last clean strip of fabric from the bodice. The sharp, tearing sound echoed softly in the quiet cabin. She folded the silk, pressing it gently against the exit wound on Silas's shoulder, binding it tight. It was the final piece of Boston, the last remnant of the helpless girl she had once been. She tied the knot, sealing the wound, and letting the past go forever. "You're going to live, Cowboy," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse, her hand lingering against his bare chest. Silas opened his eyes. They were tired, shadowed with pain, but the storm-gray depths were crystal clear. He looked at the soot on her face, the blood on her hands, and the fierce, protective light in her emerald eyes. He raised his good hand, his rough fingers tangling gently in her damp hair. "I've been living since the minute I saw you," he rasped. Heavy hoofbeats splashed into the muddy yard outside. Clara instantly reached for the colt at her hip, but Silas shook his head, listening to the cadence of the riders. "Not Gentry's men. They don't ride that organized." "Miss Vance! Silas Thorne!" a booming voice echoed over the rain. Clara stood up and walked to the shattered doorway. Sitting atop a massive bay gelding in the center of the yard was a man wearing a dripping yellow slicker and a silver star that commanded far more respect than Cobb's tin badge. United States Marshal Davies sat flanked by 6 heavily armed federal deputies. Laying in the mud, hog-tied and looking entirely pathetic, were Elias Gentry and Sheriff Cobb. Marshal Davies tipped his dripping hat to Clara. "Received a highly detailed telegram in Denver a few weeks back, Miss Vance. Took us a while to quietly verify the claims about Arthur Vance's surveying records, but you were spot on. We caught Gentry's men trying to flee the territory. Mr. Gentry here is going to stand trial for murder, extortion, and about a dozen counts of land fraud." Davies looked past Clara, eyeing the obliterated front of the cabin and the smoldering barn. "Looks like we missed a hell of a fight." "We handled it, Marshal," Clara said, her voice carrying easily over the rain. She patted the pocket of her apron, feeling the crisp fold of the canceled mortgage note. "The broken spur is secure." "I can see that," Davies nodded respectfully. "We'll send the town doctor out from Silver Creek on our way back. You folks rest up." The federal posse turned their horses, dragging the architects of their misery away into the gray morning mist. Clara stood in the doorway for a long time, letting the cool rain wash over her face. The mustangs were gone, scattered back to the Badlands. The barn was ash. The cabin was half destroyed. By any logical measure, they were ruined. But as Clara turned back to look at Silas, she had never felt richer. She walked back to him, sinking onto the floorboards and carefully leaning her head against his uninjured shoulder. Silas wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close, burying his face in her damp hair. "The debt is gone," Clara whispered. "I made him sign the release before the marshal took him." Silas let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension of 5 years finally permanently leaving his body. "The land is ours." "Yes." Silas was quiet for a moment. The rain drummed a steady, peaceful rhythm against the surviving roof overhead. He shifted slightly, grimacing at the pain in his shoulder, and reached his good hand into the small pocket of his leather vest. "I don't have much, Clara," Silas began, his voice rough with an emotion so deep it made his chest ache. "The cabin needs rebuilding. The herd is gone. My hands are rough and my life is hard. I can't give you Boston." "I told you. I don't want Boston," Clara said softly, looking up at him. Silas pulled his hand from his pocket. Resting in his massive, calloused palm was a dull silver ring. It wasn't perfectly round, and it bore the faint, hammered markings of a United States silver dollar, the only piece of true silver he had owned. He had spent the long, sleepless nights of the siege quietly filing and hammering it into a band. "I can't give you an easy life," Silas continued, his storm-gray eyes locked onto hers with absolute, unwavering devotion. "But I can give you my name. I can give you my life, my loyalty, and every beat of my heart until the day I die. You are the bravest thing I have ever known, Clara. Marry me. Be my partner." Clara stared at the hammered silver ring. The tears she had refused to shed for Gentry, for the fire and for the fear, finally spilled over her lashes. They weren't tears of sorrow, but of profound, overwhelming joy. She didn't hesitate. She didn't need to think. "Yes," she breathed, a brilliant, breathtaking smile breaking through the dirt and soot on her face. "Yes, Silas, always." Silas's hand trembled slightly as he slid the silver band onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of rain, tears, and absolute salvation. There were no ghosts left between them. The auction block, the terror, the debts, they had all burned away in the fire of the broken spur. They sat together on the floorboards of their ruined cabin as the sun finally broke through the gray clouds, casting a golden, brilliant light across the plains. The land was scarred, and the work ahead would be grueling. But they had survived the night, and for the first time in their lives, they were truly, finally, safe.